So first and foremost, why are we here? We're here to discuss MEPC 84 and the impact that has on shipping and exactly what that will create and what it is to create in the forthcoming period. We all know about October and how effectively the can wasn't just kicked down the road, everything was halted in action. So let's look at what's happened recently and what the potentials are as we move into the next phase. So there's been extensive discussions taking place. And basically, sorry about that. There's been something flash up my screen now, which is AI related. I'm just going to get that off. So extensive discussions have taken place on the Net Zero Framework Agreement to adjustment. So there's not been any further steps forward with regards to what's happening with the Net Zero Framework, but there has been a little bit more cooperation from what we gather across some of the party. There's been papers submitted from various, including Liberia and Japan, and there's been a little bit more cooperation, as we say, on working towards the next phase. This doesn't mean we know exactly how the next phase is going to work, but everybody seems to be working towards what they would like to see as a global regulation, as opposed to regional patchwork quilt, which are the concerns for many of the ship owners we've spoke to, many of our members, many across the industry. And obviously we've got various regional schemes coming into play. It's already complicated enough trying to comply with what's being put in place by the EU. But if we have more regional variations, that's going to create problems. So there is a consensus that we would like to see some sort of a global regulation put forward, and hopefully we will see something in the near future. Slightly different and slightly off topic to what we normally talk about, but the reason we're bringing it to your attention is because it has a potential to cost you money as ship owners and operators. So the adopted amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 for Northeast Atlantic as an ECA, as an emission control area, for SOx, for sulfur oxides, particulate matter, and nitrous oxides. And that means amendments enter into force on the 1st of September 2027, with a 0.10% sulfur cap following 12 months later. In some ways, that makes things easier because we all know a lot of port ships are calling out now. There's confusion over which port is 0.10, which port isn't. This will make it a little bit more of a level playing field and should make it a little bit easier to understand. The requirement for NOx Tier 3 engine certification will apply to ships contracted on or after the 1st of January 2027, or in the absence of a building contract, the constructed keel laid date on or after the 1st of July 2027, or a delivery date after the 1st of January 2031. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is obviously because you will need to have a suitable engine to take on these, regional changes. You'll need to have suitable requirements to meet those standards, and making sure that your trading exclusions are sufficient. We see a lot of questions and potential contractual disputes over this very topic when it comes to whether the ship is Tier 3 compliant or not. And you may ask, what's behind that and what is it? I mean, particulate matter is for ships of solid particles and droplets as soot, black carbon, sulfates, and heavy metals released by burning heavy fuel and marine engines. And they can cause respiratory problems, diseases, cardiovascular issues, and damage to marine ecosystems. We're very familiar about nitrous oxides and the risks and the damage that causes. And your vessel will need to, in some cases, will use urea, and that's an extra cost to ship owners, and that's something that needs to be considered as well. Urea is part of a selective catalytic reduction system, and that's similar in some cases to some diesel cars built after 2015 up until modern day, where you have a separate urea tank. And effectively what it does is it splits up the harmful nitrous oxide gases and makes them into nitrogen and water before the catalyst itself. So that's something that needs to be considered, and something that we will see going there. Approved amendments to the NOx Technical Code. That's engines using non-carbon fuels or fuel mixtures. That includes things like ammonia. And then commenced second phase of the review of the carbon intensity indicator and the ship energy efficiency management plan. That's something that Edwin's going to talk about in a little bit more detail as we go throughout this presentation. We brought this picture up here because obviously we're talking about a political backdrop. The political backdrop is going to influence what happens. As we've said before, we really want to move towards a global regulation, but there is political forces which will come into play and are going to determine what happens at a later stage with this IMO net zero framework. As a bit of humor, I thought I'd type into AI and see what AI brought up on the IMO net zero framework and how it sees it panning out over the next few years. So this is purely for comedy value. And you can see that by the fact that not so many people have as many fingers as they should, and there's some typos on some of the countries. But it's quite an interesting viewpoint that AI has over this IMO net zero framework, and what is up ahead and the complications, and really how it is one big jigsaw between all of the nations. So looking into the net zero framework in a little bit more detail, 2 intersessional sessions agreed to continue negotiations. Terms of reference finalized for the 5th IMO GHG study, that's the greenhouse gas study, and guidelines supporting NZF, that's the Net Zero Fund implementation, guidance on how to monitor, report and verify wind assistance propulsion, modules for zero, near zero greenhouse gas fuels, technologies and or energy sources, ZNZ. And then we look as well at the ISWG GHG 21 topics and provisions and disbursement of revenue and development management and operation of the IMO GFI registry. Now, we all know this is a bone of contention here. It's something I'm going to touch on in one of the next slides I go on to, just to give you a bit of an overview of this. But obviously, the last thing that many parties want to avoid here is port state control, putting some sort of levy on ships and trying to keep a fair and even control over that is going to be quite hard, which is why, and we'll look at this in the next slide, that the original IMO proposal involved the use of surplus and pooling arrangements, not too dissimilar to the FuelEU Maritime, but obviously more complications are there, and we'll go through that next. The draft guidelines on sustainable fuel certification schemes, that was brought to fruition, and Edwin may get the chance to touch on that a little bit more as we go throughout this presentation. Life cycle analysis, a framework including wake to tank emission values, weighted averages, and then a risk-based approach for ILUC. What is ILUC? Many of you may ask. It's indirect land use change. And what it basically means is that when you, for example, if you have some land which you then remove the crops to change to biofuels, to grow biofuels, you're effectively starving, that crop production that was there in the first place. And that's why the RED, the Renewable Energy Directive, and various other forms look at this. And that's why, biofuels from the waste stream, for example, is more favored than biofuels which are going to starve crops. The works team proceeded to develop regulatory framework for the use of onboard carbon capture systems. That was another point that was raised. So on to this next slide here before we quickly go on to the next part of the presentation. This was something that was earlier proposed. We're not saying this is definitely going to happen, but the important thing to look at here is that the FuelEU Maritime, which is, for those of you that are unaware, is a pooling system. Effectively, ships which are using lower carbon alternative fuels get to build up a surplus, and then they can sell that to ships in a deficit who are unable to purchase or do not wish, or for whatever reason, do not purchase lower carbon fuel. The idea being is that, the surplus party can send to the deficit party, and that's the way it works effectively. Something like that, if that was in place for the IMO system, would prevent the need for local port state control collections of funds. It would prevent the need for a levy, and it would mean this system would manage itself quite effectively. But obviously, we've all just seen the recent problems with the FuelEU Maritime, the last minute problems with the verification. All right, we're over and we're through that now. now, and there's been a bit of experience from that. But this system here is even more complicated. And as you can see here, as this green party here, you can only deal with the middle party here and the surplus units. You're not able to exchange between, the very poor performers and the very high performers. So it's just something that we need to bear in mind. It's something that we may see in the future, but it's just to give you an idea. And this shows you how complicated it is, where the baseline is, what the direct compliance is, and the difference between the two, which will end up costing ship owners money and persuading ship owners, rightly so, to use lower carbon fuels. This is just an assumed calculation based on the original, the B100 and B24 fuels, and you can obviously see that a B100 fuel will obviously last right up until towards 2040. That's according to the original proposals, and like I say, there is some scope for change there. So we're just giving you a rough idea of how it may work and how complicated it may be to get through this next phase. Helen's going to touch on this more a little bit detail later, but I just really wanted to show to you the trajectory of the proposed IMO targets and how it's much steeper than the EU targets. That's something to bear in mind, obviously. So there's a lot more, definite trajectory on that. And also to bear in mind that, when we came towards October last year, the EU did say they will review the outcome of the IMO, and that will dictate what will happen with the future of the FuelEU Maritime and other regulatory drives driven by the EU. So it's important to mention that, because really what we don't want to see is, an IMO regulation brought in, and for that to complicate use for the EU, and for you to have two sets of pooling and surplus arrangements in place at the same time. Obviously, ideally, from a ship owners, ship operators, and anybody else involved in that industry's perspective, we would rather avoid that and avoid this patchwork quilt scenario. So with that now, I'm going to hand over to Edwin, and Edwin's going to go into more detail on some of the fuel certification, life cycle analysis, and various other air pollution and energy efficiency topics. So if you'd like to take control now, please, Edwin, over to you, and thank you very much, and look forward to hearing your part.
Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everyone, or good day to everyone. My name is Edwin. I have a consultancy called Arcsilea, and we do quite a lot of work on regulatory compliance and regulatory development. And with my other hat on, I chair the IMO committee of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects, who are an NGO at the IMO. And we broadly lead at the IMO on fuel certification and creating the fuel certification, sustainable fuel certification schemes, as well as on the CII review. So on this first slide here, ISWG GHG 21, which was the meeting the week before MEPC 84, broadly agreed to continue work on the draft Sustainable Fuel Certification Scheme guidelines, with the idea to finalize this at MEPC 85. And a very quick recap on this. The IMO lacks a global fuel certification scheme for sustainable fuels. We have a scheme called the RED, Renewable Energy Directive, within the EU, and you have people like ICC and RSB certifying fuels according to RED. We do not have an equivalent at the IMO. So currently, if you buy a biofuel, we have a sort of bridging proposal, which I'll also talk about a little bit later, enable you to use certified fuels according to EU standards in the IMO context. But going forward, we actually need an IMO-specific fuel certification scheme that leverages existing systems. And this is linked also to the IMO LCA Guidelines, which are slightly different. As Mark's slide already showed, you have slightly different values for the carbon intensity of the same fuel. The work on fuel certification guidelines are quite advanced, and in some ways you could see it as almost the foundation of any future regulatory framework we might have at the IMO, because then without certainty about the quality of these new fuels, we won't really be able to calculate any GFI or anything like that. The work that needs to be done then includes chain of custody, and probably quite importantly for ship owners is the revocation process. and this clarification of oversight and status of approvals in the event that issues are detected in fuel batches. There's also this thing called the FLL, which is a sort of a new document which accompanies the BDN when you purchase some fuel. So previously, all you cared about in the BDN was the physical properties of the fuel. But going forward, you'd need to know something about the purported climate benefits and sustainability characteristics of a fuel. And we will still have a POS system. Those of you who procure biofuel today will know what a POS is, a proof of sustainability. However, the FLL is a means of bringing all this information all together, because the POS is only for the sustainable component of a blend and not the fossil part of the blend. And it becomes quite difficult to track and trace all of these things together. So the FLL aims to bring all these things all together so that you have a sort of a paper chain or a document chain for verification purposes and also for assurance. Of course, as I said, we need to think a lot more about what happens if something is detected in a batch of fuel. There was fraud, something happened, someone didn't use the right feedstock, and that actually the GHG value of the fuel will be much worse than anticipated. What happens then? What's the investigation process, and what happens if the owner has already bought the fuel? And these are things we need to think about. Once the guidelines are finalized at MEPC 85, potentially schemes may make an application for their schemes to be evaluated under the IMO Sustainable Fuel Certification Scheme and recognized. But that will take some time. So once the application is made, we need to convene a group to do a very detailed evaluation of effectively the governance structures of every certification scheme. How do they audit fuel producers and so on? And so really we're looking at probably the first schemes being available towards the end of maybe 2027 or even into 2028. But this needs to almost happen first, because as I say, otherwise we will struggle to really apply the net zero framework, to implement it. Unfortunately, at the moment, the LCA guidelines themselves are not yet complete. So methodologies for how we treat recycled carbon fuel or recycled carbon e-fuels, and whether we allow negative emissions or how we allow for power purchase agreements when you're making the fuel, these things are not yet clarified within the LCA guidelines. The other things which are not clarified are the default values. Those of you familiar with FuelEU will know that for a range of fuels, you have some default values for the GHG intensity. We are currently missing some default values within the IMO LCA guidelines, including for LNG and for LFO. And technically speaking, we're not entirely sure that even the default values that are currently listed are the final ones. So there may be some further changes. This, of course, means that actually even today, you're not able to calculate a GFI. And then fuel producers are having some issue about about the certainty around the quality of the fuel they produce, or how the fuel they produce will be assessed under this new framework. The scientific body, it's called the SAMP LCA Working Group, that was tasked with the default values in LCA methodology, is actually quite overwhelmed with these issues. There's so many methodological issues that need to be resolved, and there's so many default values that need to be assessed. And they're also somewhat under-resourced. So one of the big outcomes of this meeting was that we helped to prioritize and apply some process improvements, so we could sort of really get the ball rolling and get things moving on the most critical issues, so that at the end we have a sort of minimum viable product, and then still take the time to deal with all the other issues that need to be solved. Finally, there are some guidelines on GFI verification will also be progressed. These are then to sort of look at what kind of documentation we will be getting for the fuel and how this goes into the verification process. So that's a kind of broad overview of probably the things that are quite important for the ship owner community that we did at ISWG GHG 21. My next slide here. So on to MEPC. MEPC, you've read a lot of headlines in the news, I think, about things that were going on with the net zero framework. There was probably less about what was going on in the air pollution and energy efficiency working group, which we did actually decide quite a lot of issues. So I apologize for there being lots of words, but when you get these slides, you have something very quick to refer to. The first thing was that we agreed some clarification to the guidelines for reporting underway and not underway distance. Those of you who have been reporting CII will have noticed that different class societies have been having a slightly different interpretation of whether the CII should be calculated with only underway distance or total distance. And the intention was always that even though you would end up reporting distance separately, the two distances, the calculation of CII ought to remain the same. So it's the total distance, effectively berth to berth. And so that clarification was accepted and it's incorporated into the new guidelines. In terms of the review of CII, the working group and the committee agreed to further develop strengthening of the SEMP as a means to address several of the challenges of the CII. So rather than focusing entirely on fixing the metric, which is probably never managed to 100%, to use the SEMP as a process of continuous improvement, which also gives you some flexibility and is much more ship specific than the current approach. And this now has a target completion of MEPC 86. So in the meantime, the work that will be done on this is actually to run some pilots and to start writing some guidelines so we understand how the audit process is going to work instead of having some sort of hard enforcement just based entirely on the metric itself. I spoke earlier about this sort of bridging solution for biofuels. So this is Circular 905, some of you will be familiar with. There was, when we first agreed this, a phrase in there which said that biofuel blends would be apportioned or calculated based on the proportion of energy, so it would be energy weighted. That really ended up as having a sort of slight inaccuracy in how carbon was sort of distributed between the two parts of the blends. And so this has now been corrected to be mass weighted rather than energy weighted. But however, this will only apply from the 1st of January 2027. So whatever you're doing this year, you don't have to change. You make the change next year. Those who involved in new buildings of dual fuel vessels, the EDI calculation guidelines have now been updated to apply dual fuel calculation methodology also to fuels that are not LNG. The current guidelines, or the previous guidelines, have basically restricted this only to LNG, but of course now with methanol dual fuel mainly, we've kind of extended the methodology also to methanol. Some of you may have found that actually class societies were applying it anyway, but this formalizes and standardizes the approach. There's still a bit of a question mark over how we deal with ammonia. In the meantime, I think different flag states will apply slightly different approaches to this, and this will be dealt with at a future session. For those running LNG dual fuel engines, we agreed 3 new guidelines for test bed and onboard measurement of methane and nitrous oxide, and engine load monitoring, as well as continuous emission monitoring systems. This is mainly for measuring methane slip, anticipating what might happen if we do have a net zero framework, that you may be able to use, instead of a default value for methane slip, to be able to measure your actual values. Now, you really have then, with these 3 guidelines, you have a combination, you have basically 2 options. You either do your measure your methane and nitrous oxide emissions with a mix of engine load monitoring. So what proportion of time do you spend at 30% load? What proportion of time do you spend at 40% load, 50% load, etc. And you combine this with test bed and onboard measurements, which is part of the NOx technical code and at sort of set load points. And then with this, you sort of make a calculation for to derive what is the sort of overall methane slip based on the load profile of the engine in operation. So that's one option. And the second option is continuous engine monitoring. So in effect, you're continuously monitoring your methane and nitrous oxide emissions. So the methodology and the guideline for how you would do this is now in place, without prejudice to what we ultimately decide in the LCA guidelines. So there may still be some adjustments as to how we use these measurements and apply them directly to the GFI calculations. That part isn't solved yet, but this sort of exists. So those of you with Fuel EU ships will note that the EU has separate guidance on this, which is related to a slightly earlier version of these guidelines. There is no clarity yet on when the EU will update their guidance, so they may continue for a little while so as not to change things in the middle of a reporting period. And we expect that at some point everything will be harmonized. Finally, the OCCS. As Mark mentioned, work on OCCS is continuing. However, there was a recognition that of systems which directly or indirectly dispose of CO2 into the sea from a ship, noting that this sort of almost constitutes a kind of form of dumping. And so the London Convention needs to be sort of also checked on. But there is a sort of a fairly significant amount of work going on in OCCS. And there was a revised timescale and work plan for how that's going to be done. So that's my sort of update, and then I'm going to let Helen take over.
Thank you very much, Edwin, and thanks to Mark as well. I will just take control of the slides and move on. So I'm Helen Barden. I'm a director in the External Affairs team of NorthStandard, and I also, together with Mark, lead on the Navigating Decarbonisation expertise team work that we do within the club. So my section is actually going to be quite brief because we are in that sort of limbo period when it comes to the clarity around the net zero framework. But I'll have a quick canter through a couple of the Charter Party or kind of legal aspects that we can have a think about following MEPC 84. So we've already heard that we're likely expecting delays when it comes to the net zero framework. On this slide, I've put the dates of what we do know in terms of the dates for the intersessional working groups in September, and then also prior to MEPC 85 in November, with MEPC 85 running towards the end of November and into December. And then should the MEPC second extraordinary session go ahead, that will be on the Friday of that week on the 4th of December. But really we are looking now at likely considerable delays and the chances of agreement, I suppose, being reached on the net zero framework during that meeting aren't necessarily looking like that will happen. So just in terms of the net zero framework and the different elements that are on the table in terms of how that might change, we don't really know yet quite what the economic element will be. So that has been quite a bone of contention, as Mark's already highlighted earlier. So there were proposals put on the table in terms of kind of removing the IMO fund element, also removing the economic element, which some see as a tax on shipping. And there is also an awful lot that would need to be done in any event to get not just the industry comfortable, I suppose, with the IMO being a revenue collector, but also in terms of the kind of practicalities and technicalities of being able to get such a fund up and running in any event within a short period of time. So I think what we could end up looking at is perhaps some sort of compromise between the two, and whether we end up with some sort of port state compliance enforcement action. Mark's already mentioned that can sometimes be quite problematic because you end up with different actions being taken by different port state controls. It could mean different fine levels, for example. If we don't end up with port state control action and we do end up with something within the net zero framework itself in terms of some sort of economic element, then we might be looking at something like that Fuel EU kind of pooling structure. What we have learnt from, for example, the CII regulations, though, is that where enforcement within a regulation is weaker, it can then sometimes be more difficult to engage those within the Charter Party chain. And actually, it's going to be really important that whatever the enforcement or kind of economic element that gets decided in terms of the net zero framework, that the parties do ensure that they're joined up in terms of compliance with the net zero framework, because it's going to need, for example, the charterer's input as regards the fuel choice for the vessel. That's going to be really key. And Edwin's already highlighted some of the documentation that's going to be needed in terms of supporting that process around the certification. I've just put on this slide Fuel EU versus IMO, and the point that I wanted to make really here is that obviously at the moment the options on the table look at these kind of flexible mechanisms when it comes to compliance, and as I mentioned, we might still end up with this sort of flexible mechanism, albeit it might not be quite as heavy a penalty, for example. But I think the learnings that we've got from Fuel EU are going to be really important in terms of that transition towards the net zero framework in the event that we do end up with some sort of flexible compliance mechanism. And the novel agreements that we've seen developed from the contractual side of things, like the pooling agreements for Fuel EU Maritime, though what we have there is actually going to be quite useful in this phase for the net zero framework, should we see that sort of mechanism being kept under the net zero framework. So I think there are learnings that we can have, and I would certainly encourage those that are needing to comply with Fuel EU Maritime trading into the EU, any feedback in relation to not just the contractual architecture around Fuel EU Maritime, but also any technical issues, feeding that back so that those can be fed into the IMO discussions as well, because I think there is potentially quite a synergy between the two. And then just as I mentioned at the start, we are in a bit of a limbo period when it comes to being able to have any sort of certainty around drafting for the net zero framework. So really what we can do is kind of look at what might be coming into force in the coming years. That there may well be charter parties that are going to be spanning, that you're entering into, that are going to be spanning the years to come. If we're looking at, say, 2029 as likely the kind of best case scenario or earliest that we're going to see a net zero framework coming into force, you're probably really looking at charter parties that are going to be spanning beyond that period as to whether you need to be concerned about getting something into your charter party at this point in time. Obviously, putting something in a charter party now without clarity on the actual specifics of the framework does provide for some ambiguity, and obviously the more ambiguous drafting is in a charter party, the more chance there are of disputes. So that's something to think about in terms of whether you really feel that you need to get something in, and if you do, then you can obviously reach out to your FD&D contacts or myself or any of the others on the Navigating Decarbonisation expertise team, and we can help support with that. The other point I would just mention is that the indications are that once there is clarity around the net zero framework, that BIMCO does intend to progress work, obviously drafting an IMO net zero framework clause for charter parties. So that's something that should be following once we get to the point where we know exactly what we're dealing with the net zero framework. And that is all I have to say on the contractual aspects, and I will hand back to Mark. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you very much, Edwin. Both excellent explanations of what's taking place and what's going on at the moment. I'm going to stop sharing this screen in a minute, and there's a couple of questions came in during the registration process. I'm just going to address them, and then we can see if there's any other questions coming after that. So one of the first questions we received was about STCW qualifications, and as yet nothing mandatory is in place. There's lots of guidelines. The latest IMO framework with the STCW 7 Circular 25 was issued on September 25. And then HTW 12 in February 26 was looking at fuel-specific guidance, specifically on ammonia, ethanol, methanol, and then further guidance is planned for hydrogen, LPG, and battery systems. It's not to say that at NorthStandard we're not taking this seriously ourselves. We are working on a platform at the moment to describe the risks of these new alternative fuels, and the plan is to share that with our members in due course. And obviously we would like to be involved with any training requirements to try and help our members and to try and help the industry as a whole. But there's nothing mandatory in place at the moment. And in fact, we were speaking to somebody more recently from the MCA about the ammonia qualifications, and part of the problem they had was, validating the endorsements of ammonia fueled vessels, because some of these ammonia fueled vessels are sailing around and they're not actually using ammonia. So the chief engineers and engineers on board the vessels aren't able to get endorsements on their qualifications. So the MCA has actually had to provide another course at some of the colleges to try and fill some of those gaps. So it's a little bit chicken and egg in some ways, that we can't get the experience on board the vessels because we don't have the vessels here yet, but we need to get the crew trained for the use of those alternative fuels. So yeah, so that's one of the problems that we see over the horizon. The next questions, the other questions we received, I think we've addressed throughout the presentation. There was a specific question, the two specific questions I'm sort of going to point your way, Edwin. One is with respect to the IMO DCS for self-unloading vessels. I'm not aware of any major changes specifically to self-unloading vessels, but if you could correct me on that, please, that would be appreciated, Edwin. And the other question, just to point in your direction, is planned updates on CII, but I think you've covered a little bit of that already. But if there's anything else you want to bring to the attention of the audience, that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. On self-unloading vessels, I believe there was a paper to MEPC 83 suggesting dedicated reference lines for self-unloading vessels. That wasn't taken up yet. And I think what's going to happen is so the SENT proposal is actually for ships to be compared not against the average of the sector, and therefore for self-unloading vessels to be compared with conventional bulk carriers, but actually to apply the improvement target to the performance of the vessel in the previous year. So in a way, it's to try and compare vessels with themselves. And that, in effect, will ultimately mean that the improvement target is very ship-specific, and it would mean that even self-unloading bulk carriers may not necessarily need a dedicated reference line. The other thing that may happen, which is also linked to the other question, is what we're going to do with the CII metric. So some of you may be aware that there is a proposal to change the CII metric from total fuel consumption over distance to only fuel consumption from the main engine during sea passage over distance. And so all of the generator and boiler fuel consumption is no longer included in the calculation of the CII. This is a proposal which we need to debate and discuss. And for self-unloading bulk carriers, that means that all of the power and the fuel consumption needed for the self-unloading machinery will no longer be part of this. Of course, the shape and the design of the bulk of a self-unloader may still be somewhat different, but it may end up, because of this, being much closer to a conventional vessel, also depending on the speed that it's sailed and so on. So these two things together may mitigate to a certain extent the need for dedicated reference lines. And I think that deals also with the plan update and CII question.
It would be quite hard to calculate exactly how much fuel you're consuming for, self-unloading in some situations, wouldn't it? Really, it's not an easy thing to calculate in my experience, So, yeah, interesting. Thank you. If there's no more other questions, I mean, we appreciate this has been quite a brief update. We did, know that there's not necessarily any hard and fast solutions to everybody's questions. So this was just a forum to bring you up to date with what's happened. If there's no more questions, I'm going to give it another minute and allow for other questions to come in. then what we will say is that please watch this space. Obviously, as we head towards the period November and late December, the timelines shown by Helen earlier on, and I'll bring those up on the presentation again. Then we will look to bring you an update closer to that. But at this moment in time, like we say, there's a little bit of uncertainty surrounding it. The eco areas is probably the most definitive that we've got. Just bring up the timelines here so we can see them again. But yeah, we obviously look at working towards bringing you something towards the end of November, and let's hope that we have a little bit more, certainty as we head towards the end of the year. I'm not too sure we will. I'm not too sure we can guarantee that, but I think progress has been made from what I gather. Let's just hope it continues to be made, and let's just hope the geopolitical differences don't influence it too much, and we all get what we need, which is an easy to use, manageable solution to help ships decarbonize. It sounds easier than it's ever going to be, doesn't it? But I don't think it's ever going to be that easy. There's always going to be problems over the horizon, questions and technical concerns. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share this slide here. That's got all of our email addresses on. Please feel free to contact any of us, you know what I mean? And feel free to use Edwin in his consultancy capacity. I know Edwin's very busy and employed by a lot of organizations and some great work that you're doing, but he's very good at keeping those complicated topics very easy to understand and digest. So please feel free to reach out to Edwin, or please feel free to reach out to Helen or myself. And if any of our members want individual discussions over any of these items, then please feel free to get in touch. I'm just going to check that there's no questions in the Q&A or the chat before we go. Oh, sorry, we've got one here come in there. Sorry, Calvin Wittenberg. So ref CII proposal on excluding oxy engine consumption for self-run loaders. What are the timelines regarding this proposal? Are you able to answer that, please, Edwin?
Yeah, thanks, Bart, and thanks for the plug as well. So it's hard to figure out what the timeline is. The phase 2 review of the CII has a bit of a flexible timescale, and it will depend on proposals being sent through and how much analysis and comfort the regulators want before agreeing to it. But a rough guess would be broadly we need to agree the shape of the or the direction of the CII metric, also probably by MEPC 86. So probably middle of next year. We may not. I think we won't have the final version, but anything to do with the resetting the CII baselines, which is what this would effectively do, then we need to collect data and analyze it and then redraw the baseline. So even if we agree something at MEPC 86, we'd be waiting until 2028 to receive the data of that year, and then analyze it, draw new baselines, and then there's a whole sort of update process for the ship owners as well, to rewrite their targets and and the measures they will use to achieve them. So really, I would say, in terms of when it will be implemented, we're looking at 2029, 2030.
Thank you. Yeah, there's always quite a lead time on any of these things, isn't there? It takes a while to get them in place, but no, excellent, thank you. So with that, I don't think we've got any more questions in the chat. Like I say, please feel free, because sometimes you might, come to the end of this meeting and think, oh, I wish I'd asked that, I wish I'd asked that, It's always the case, so please feel free to reach out to any one of us. I would like to thank Edwin and Helen for their time and expert intervention on all of these topics and explaining in a very clear and concise manner and exactly how this is going to work over the near period. I'd like to thank everybody in support of us from the digital team in getting these presentations, slides, invites and everything ready to the outside world and the audience that we have here today. Most of all, I would like to thank all of you and our members and everybody taking part in this webinar for coming along, asking the questions, and for giving us a reason to continue and to do these. So thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Any questions, please feel free to give us a touch. Thanks again, and I'll allow Edwin and Helen to say thank you and goodbye too. And I hope you all have a good day.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Edwin. Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Helen. Thanks, everyone. Bye.